Tariffs. Who knew that tariffs would be so exciting and that we'd all be cross-border experts, by the midpoint of 2025? So really happy to bring Denise and Eric on stage. So Elliott Davis, if you're not familiar with them or haven't spoken to them out there, they're a leading business solutions firm. They offer a lot of different services from tax, assurance, and consulting services. We're very proud that we've been around for 11 years. They've been around for around 100 years. Not these two individuals themselves, of course. But Denise, why don't you help us explain a bit more of what is Elliott Davis and how do you support these large brands that you guys work with?
Yes, absolutely. So it's been so good to be here the last 2 days and just to make some really good connections. And I know for many of you, this is the first you've heard of Elliott Davis. Elliott Davis has traditionally been known as a 100-year-old tax and audit consulting firm. What a lot of people do not realize is I would say for the last 40 years, there's been a really big focus on the consulting around life cycles in a company. So whether you're starting your company or you're looking to exit from that company, we want to come alongside of you and be that partner beside you through all of that. And so that's what we're have our offices located throughout the Southeast, but we service companies all over and have international, obviously, companies as well that we get to service. And a lot of the things that we're focusing on now is, I would say, the manufacturing distribution space is big. And so the focus area that I have that I'll just hone in on a little bit is I lead our business systems consulting practice. And so everything around people, process, and technology, and Eric will tell you a little bit more around the tariff space that he plays in, but it all flows really well together, and you're going to hear more about that when we talk today. But yeah, so everything. The other thing, too, I would just put a plug out there. I know with a lot of those that I've been speaking with over the last couple of days, as you're expanding into additional states and jurisdictions, always important to look at that, too, because there's a lot of credits and incentives out there that we help clients talk through that, too, through their planning. So.
Awesome. Well, I know tariffs, de minimis, duties, we're going to dive into that quite a bit shortly. But, from concept to consumption, how else can you maybe dive into some of the ways that brands, I know there's a lot of different ways they can work with Elliott Davis, but what are some of the ways that they start working with you and then, of course, expand, how they are able to leverage Elliott Davis as a partner?
Yes, exactly. So think of it when a company first starts to grow, right? They have the, if you think about it, your initial launch, you have your first life cycle might be just we need to get up and running and get things going. And then after a while you have, hey, we need some process in place, we need some technology in place to do that. So that's where a lot of this comes in at, because when you look at from beginning to end of that product life cycle, you've got your ERP system layers over that. And this is also where ShipBob comes in from the warehouse management piece to help fulfill that. And I would always encourage you, I'll put a plug out there, outsourcing, things like that, usually is a game changer for you, as many of you have seen. And so from the time that that product is, the concept until it is distributed. So your ERP system is going to layer over all of that. But then the hot topic we have now, too, is what do we do with these tariffs and what's happening? So I know Eric is helping a lot of clients through that piece. Yeah,
so I know, at least my colleagues often are asking me how much time I'm spending on ChatGPT to learn everything about taxes and duties and de minimis, but I actually use Eric GPT. So I email him or get him to join us on the webinars. Yes, we all do. So I know that, this is very top of mind for everybody in this room. It's been a constant theme that's been coming up over time. So if you can just help us think through, what are some of the basics or the fundamentals that people should think through? And then I know we're going to dive into some actual examples with some numbers, which I think will help people visualize the differences by the different places that they might manufacture.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'll start by saying when this all started, I had hair. So I think it was a lot easier to navigate before 2018 or before 2024 when the election took place. But now I think what everybody needs to understand is that tariffs are protectionist by nature, right? It used to be the single source of revenue for the government before we had income tax. And it was the only way for us to really fund all the support services that our government provides all of our citizens. So its primary function is to produce revenue and protect domesticated industry. But what we're talking about in the news right now is not necessarily the tariff rates that we always think about with the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States. That's I have this specific commodity and I have this 10-digit tariff code and there's a 5% duty rate on that. That's not what we're really talking about in the news. What we're talking about in the news are tariffs that are imposed above that base tariff rate, what we call the most favored nation tariff rate. That would be implemented through statute and declaration and executive order by the president. So Congress, in our government, Congress has the right to impose tariffs, but they have delegated that responsibility to the executive branch through a number of statutes. There's 5 of them on the screen right now. Those 5 statutes give the president authority to add additional tariffs onto the most favored nation tariff rate. And they all stack on top of each other. I'm going to talk about 3 really quickly. The first 3, Section 232 deals with national security. And that's why you see it being applied with steel, aluminum, copper, pharmaceuticals, lumber, things of that nature. Because if we find ourselves in a war where our national security is at risk, those types of materials, those raw materials, are needed for our defense mechanism, right? Aerospace, buildings, railways, logistics. We need steel, aluminum, copper, lumber. And so the Commerce Department is responsible to do an investigation and say these commodities are at risk. And once they're deemed to be at risk, then we impose additional tariffs on foreign materials so that we can produce our own here in the US. That's Section 232. A lot of those are pretty high right now. Steel and aluminum, copper tariffs are at 50%. So let's say you purchase steel from overseas and you import it into the United States. You have your most favored nation tariff rate, let's call it 2 to 5% in chapter like 73, 76, maybe some derivatives of steel in chapter 84, 85 for machinery. Let's say that's 5%. Well, there's 50% on top of that if you import it. So now you're at 55%. That your cost basis just went up 55%, right? It's crazy. The next one is Section 301. And for those of you who remember the first Trump administration, Section 301 really took off in 2018. The USTR, the United States Trade Representative, is currently Jamieson Greer, has to undergo an investigation of unfair trade practices against the United States. Once that's deemed to be true, then the president can impose additional tariffs on certain lists of commodities. They have to list out the tariff codes that are impacted. There's currently 4 lists, and they range from 7.5% additional to 25, even up to 100% for some. The Biden administration kind of doubled down on Section 301, and there's certain products like electric vehicles that got slapped with 100% tariffs. So from 7.5 to 100%. And then the third is IEEPA, and this is the one that's in the news, okay? This is the Emergency Economic Powers Act. And this gives the president authority to impose economic sanctions on foreign nations. But it has never before been used to impose tariffs. So the government is interpreting IEEPA to give them the authority to impose tariffs, not other forms of economic sanction. And it's being challenged in the courts. And last week, while we were all worried about the August 1st deadline of new tariff rates and reciprocal tariff rates, the Court of Appeals actually heard oral arguments on whether or not IEEPA is legal. Okay, so this is kind of in flux, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court. But until then, all of these IEEPA tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, the border tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, the Russian oil tariff on India that came out last week, those are all being implemented based on IEEPA. Okay? Now, if that goes away, and let's say the Supreme Court rules against the president having the authority to use it for tariffs, he's just going to pivot to one of these other statutes and re-up. Okay, it's not going away. The tariff thing is here to stay, even if that gets shut down.
Well, you answered my next question on is it or is it not going away, but let's maybe stay with IEEPA for a second, and maybe I'm conflating the two things, but you know, with the big beautiful bill, it's set de minimis, we'll go from tariffs to de minimis out to mid-2027, at least for the rest of the world outside of China and Hong Kong. With the executive order that came out about a week and a half ago, obviously that pulled it forward to the end of this month. I think it's August 29th. Was that through IEEPA, or what pulled that forward so far?
So let's take it in 2 steps. Let's take it in 3 steps. First, we had the executive order that removed it for China and Hong Kong earlier this year. Then we passed the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which permanently repeals the statute. So Section 321 that we were all using for Type 86 entries into the U.S. for, shipments under $800 could come in duty-free. That permanently repealed it, and that's now law. So that's the permanent repeal of statute Section 321. So now the president came on top of that and said, until that actually starts happening, July 1st of 2027, according to the bill, I'm going to immediately suspend it until that time for all countries. So once it passed and became law with a due date, the president just said, I'm going to up the ante and I'm going to suspend it until that time. And it wasn't, there's a lot of lobbying involved in this, okay? So like a lot of it is who had the president's ear, who had the administration's ear. A lot of domestic industries wanted this repealed, right? But, truth be told, the rest of the world is also considering similar, repeals of their de minimis levels. Ours was pretty high. $800 is pretty high for a de minimis, to be honest. The rest of the world may be floating around $200. That makes a little bit more sense to me. But yeah, I think that you'll see the UK and the EU kind of also look at those low-value shipments. A lot of it is coming from the fact that we feel like China might be dumping undervalued goods into all of their selling markets to make up for the fact that the tariffs are hitting them so hard. So now they're keeping their production capacities going, and they're trying to dump a lot of goods that they lowered the values on into the rest of the world to make up for some of their lost exports to the United States.
Well, let's stay on that for a sec, just with China and some of the other countries from a manufacturing perspective. And so with non-Chinese countries essentially having a 2-year window that they thought they'd have from a manufacturing perspective to grab some market share. Now the rules are flat across the board. How do you think that will play out between, now there's less impact from China comparatively, so how do you think that will play out across just different areas or different regions?
Yeah. Okay, the interconnectedness of global trade. The big question is, how interconnected is the world? Globalization, post-World War II was the norm, and the United States, under the General Agreements of Tariffs and Trade, right, which became the World Trade Organization, we agreed to kind of support the rebirth of the world that had been destroyed through a world war. And our economy was the last man standing, and everybody else was having to rebuild their continents. And we agreed to have higher tariffs at that point. And it made sense because we had money to spend and the rest of the world did not. Okay, so that was kind of the basis of globalization. And it continued to grow, especially post-Cold War, when the United States sort of agreed to protect all the waterways in the world, that our Navy would be responsible for making it safe to move product from point A to point B on big ships, right? And for years and years and years, that had been the case. And then we saw the Houthis in the Red Sea kind of break what we thought was going to be safe, travel. And we had just taken it for granted for so many years. And then all of a sudden, an entire major narrow waterway in the world was cut off by some makeshift bombs, right? That the Houthis were deploying on any ship that was going through the Red Sea. And it changed our thinking about everything globalization. And then it came to regional trade. And the world has now been fractured essentially between BRICS plus nations and G7 nations. You can kind of split the world in half. The McKinsey Institute did an incredible study on this, and they used 2022 as a baseline. And at that time, 15% of global trade was between Eastern and Western nations. If the current trend continues, by 2035, only 2% of global trade will be between Eastern and Western nations. So we're going to see hyper-regionalization, local for local markets. Your supply chain is going to need to be somewhat more regional to be able to satisfy the demand being generated by your consumers because the world is so fractured. It's not easy to transport your goods anymore from 8,000 miles away production to your local market in the U.S. anymore. It's also why it's so important that you have somebody like Denise on your side who can integrate all of these systems and account for all of these like all these changes that we didn't think were coming. De minimis being ruled out, inventory management struggling, tariff impositions, tariff stacking, all of these things. Now, the calculus of global trade has changed so much that if you don't have systems to be able to support you, you can't reasonably make sure that your margins aren't just eroding over and over and over.
Yeah, I can't imagine the complexity from an accounting standpoint with dealing that, especially if if you're a larger brand that's growing pretty quickly and also opening up new markets. And so these, we got a couple slides from you that I always love to get the updates over time because you really do start to see the impact of where you're manufacturing. And so let's talk through like a real world example. I know in this example we've got a shirt, but if you can, walk us through best cost country and how some brands should maybe think about that when they're deciding the trade-offs between looking at manufacturers outside of China or wherever they're manufacturing today.
Sure, this is a great example. But the tariff stacking is obviously the greatest on China. And you're gonna see that the most favored nation rate, this example is a polyester polo shirt that's manufactured. The first column's country of origin, China. It's 32% duty into the United States. That's the most favored nation tariff rate, right? That's your regular tariff rate. But then you have Section 301 at 7.5%, which the other countries don't have because they weren't part of Section 301. And then you have the IEEPA border tariff or the IEEPA fentanyl tariff. China's at 20% on that. Then you have the IEEPA reciprocal rate, which is another 10%. So what would have cost you, $4 or $5 FOB now costs you almost double that by the time you're ready to export from China, right? So your cost basis just went through the roof in China for this particular item. Now when you go over to Vietnam and you look at a marginally higher FOB cost to start, right? Because maybe the labor is a little bit more expensive or the internal logistics in Vietnam aren't quite as efficient as in China. So like the railways and the ports aren't as efficient to the factory base. So it costs a little bit more. It was $6 in China, it's $6.95 in Vietnam. But there's no border IEEPA and the reciprocal at the time was only 10%. I think now it's at 20% for Vietnam, right? Is it what it says on the screen? I can't see it. 20%. And now there's this idea of transshipment, right? And the government has yet to clearly define what they mean when they say if they deem it has been transshipped. Okay? We still need more guidance from Customs and Border Protection on transshipment. Because what if in this particular scenario, all the raw materials for this shirt originate in China and the substantial transformation into a shirt is done in Vietnam? Is the government going to deem that that was transshipped from China? Or is it going to be substantially transformed into a new item in Vietnam and we're going to be able to import it country of origin Vietnam and avoid all the stacking? We still need some clarity on that from Customs and Border Protection. Then the last country here is El Salvador by comparison, where you can see now your FOB cost basis is much higher because you're in the Western Hemisphere. It costs a lot more to do your production there. However, it's CAFTA DR, or DR CAFTA, which is a duty-free arrangement, preferential treatment. It's a free trade agreement. So the most favored nation rate drops to 0, and then they're hit with the reciprocal tariff, and they're currently at 10%. Of note here, a lot of the CAFTA DR countries were not named in last week and a half's executive order in Annex 1. They were left off. They did not get bumped up. A lot of these countries went from 10% and they got bumped to 15 or 20. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, apparel, footwear, and textile brands, you ought to be taking advantage of this. I'm telling you right now, this area of the world did not get called out last week when the rates went up. So you need to look at that.
When is the next big tariff update coming?
Well, today was the day, right? We're supposed to hear about whether China's rate was going to go from the 10% that was negotiated in Geneva and ratchet back up. And we just moments ago got a pause on that. So another 90-day window for us to continue negotiating. So we'll see where that shakes out. And I think then the next big one, all eyes on India, who were hit with 25% earlier when the executive order came out. And then because of sort of some of the constraints in the negotiations and our desire for them to buy US oil instead of Russian oil, we slapped them with an additional 25%. So the basis in India right now is 50%. And I think that negotiation is going to continue, and it's going to be pretty difficult because we want them to buy US oil and US agriculture products, and they want to buy domestic agriculture products and Russian oil. So it's a big divergence there.
So I know you're not the decision maker here, and I don't have a crystal ball, but looking at some of the trends and what's been shared lately with countries like China or Vietnam, where do you see maybe the floor and the ceiling kind of shaking out? Because that seems like what a lot of the brands want is at one point what China was like at almost 150%. That's
Right.
obviously not sustainable for a lot of the people in this room or anywhere. So yeah, I guess where do you see that floor and ceiling kind of shaking out?
What a great question. And you're going to need some complex systems to help you with that. So again, why I love that Denise is up here, because she helps us sort of architect solutions. This is great when you look at a slide. How do you put that in an ERP system? Then how do you do it in a sales and operations planning model or demand planning model to have maybe digital twins of sourcing scenarios for your what-if best cost country sourcing model? It gets really, really complicated.
It gets really complicated. And one thing I would just say to that point is your profile of your items in your ERP system, that is going to be so important how you have those built out. And then obviously how your bill of materials is built out as well. But that item profile is going to, that's like your birth certificate, right, for the item. And so make sure that you have the proper tracking. I know sometimes you can have custom fields to track certain things. That's going to be very important. And I know you might even need to track some information around the different vendors that you source from, what countries those are. All those things are going to be very important. So I would just say take a really deep look at that. And then also along with your chart of accounts and how that flows into your item list is going to be really important, because that's what's going to hit your bottom line and how your financials are going to be reflected from all this information. But it's just a good time to take a look. What we're seeing right now too is, you as those decision makers in your business, you've got to know immediately what that cost margin is on those products. And it is becoming so slim. I know I have a client that's in the apparel space, and he said he was given a scenario of an order he was putting out, but the margins are so slim right now with the tariffs that are in place, it doesn't really make sense for him to even process that order. And so that's why he was looking at some of those things a little deeper. But yeah, very important. And that's where to even execute what Eric is saying and be able to put that into something that you can actually make sense out of.
So when you have well-architected systems that can help you scenario plan, then we can start looking at floor and ceiling. We can look at where do we think it's going to land, right? Today, my current tariff exposure in China is 55% or whatever it is, right? What's it going to be tomorrow? The crystal ball solution is, I deal with it in hemispheres, to be honest, Eastern and Western. If you look at Southeast Asia right now, I think the mark is around 20%. We have Vietnam at 20. And I think, I have a lot of friends in Washington, and I sat at a conference just a couple weeks ago in DC where we were talking about this very issue of like, where is it going to end? And the answer I always got was economic security is national security. And now they're like publicizing that with Customs and Border Protection. Economic security is national security. I'm like, okay, so what's the number? And they're like, Eastern Hemisphere, Vietnam, their close relation. Vietnam's not vertical in all of their manufacturing, right? A lot of those raw materials still originate in China. And because of that close relationship, and we want to continue to put pressure on China for economic security, I think 20% is going to kind of be the baseline in Southeast Asia. And you see Vietnam came in at 20, and the rest of Southeast Asia, Indonesia got a 19% deal, a couple others got 19%. India was going to come in at 25 until they started to like sort of renegotiate. And so we don't like that, so we slapped them with an additional 25. If you're willing to negotiate and you show market access for US products into the foreign market, I think we're going to be around 20% in Southeast Asia. The Western Hemisphere, with a lot of our preferential trade agreements like DR-CAFTA, I think we're going to see us stick around this 10% reciprocal rate, right? So we were duty-free, and we still are for the most favored nation rate, but the reciprocal tariff is coming in at around 10%. So I think 10 to 15% is going to kind of be the baseline for the rest of the world. You see that also with the UK deal at 10%, the EU at 15%. Japan got 15% because they were making this huge investment through loans and some of their decisions to make foreign direct investment into the US market. So the administration has shown if you're willing to make investment in the US, you're going to get a preferential reciprocal tariff rate. The EU deal is very unique in the sense that 15% was their ceiling. It's different than every other reciprocal tariff. 15%, so if the most favored nation rate was only 5%, then they would only increase it 10 to get to 15. The rest of these stack. The rest of these reciprocal tariffs stack on top of the most favored nation rate. So if you were at 5%, and 15% is added, and you're now at 20%.
Yeah, and I'm glad you called out, what Denise and her team really focus on, which is really the systems building, because there's one thing of what the tariff is at the point of the purchase order, and there's another thing once it hits, land here in the U.S. And so juggling that as well. But I just really want to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. I know Eric's joined us for quite a few webinars. I think the first one we had slotted for 30 minutes and extended that to the full hour, and we were still bombarded with a bunch of questions. So really appreciate your guys' partnership this year and looking forward to evolving this. So thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it.